Good evening, my friends. We are continuing with this wonderful book in Divine Friendship by Swami Ananda. We're about halfway through it. Looks wonderful. So let's pray together and then we'll have a little music and a little meditation. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master Paramahansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, dear friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to feel your presence in all that we do, that we can act in this world in constant awareness, that you are guiding us, that we may feel that we are alone, but we are never alone, that you are always with us. We are your children. Comfort us, bless us, guide us, bring us to our divine home. Om. Peace. Amen.
An empty vessel, empty vessel, empty vessel. I am but an empty vessel, filled with the presence of God. Oh, filled with the presence of God. I am love, I am joy, I am peace. I am but an empty vessel, empty vessel, empty vessel. I am but an empty vessel, filled with the presence of God. Oh, filled with the presence of God. I am love, I am joy, I am peace. I am but an empty vessel, empty vessel, empty vessel. I am but an empty vessel, filled with the presence of God. Oh, filled with the presence of God. I am love, I am joy, I am peace. I am but an empty vessel, empty vessel, empty vessel. I am but an empty vessel, filled with the presence of God. Oh, filled with the presence of God. I am love, I am joy, I am peace. I am but an empty vessel, empty vessel, empty vessel. I am but
Okay, my friends, we went halfway through a very intense and interesting letter last time, and we're just going to have to finish it now. For those, just to give you the tiniest bit of context, this was written in May, the end of May 1998. The Bertolucci lawsuit had resolved itself at the end of February of 1998. As soon as it was over, Swamiji moved to Assisi, Italy. He resigned from his official duties. He repudiated all income from Ananda or Ananda Assisi. And then he wrote this letter to Jyotish, who was the spiritual director of Ananda, was and is. Especially after Swami put in his resignation, he turned over all his duties to Jyotish and also to Devi. And Vidura was the manager. And we explained last week that Swami had set it up. You have a spiritual director and then you have a manager, so that the spiritual director can be one step away from the practical considerations and then can keep a view of the overall. And Swami was very concerned because once Swami's presence was removed from the village, and once his certain financial support that he had offered to this creative team of 5 people that he'd built up, there was an inclination to dissolve that team. And that's as much of a summary as I can give. If what happens now doesn't make sense, I'll just have to send you back to the other class, because I can't repeat the whole thing. So he says, so Swami's just talking about what it means to lose that creative team. So he says, and indeed there has, what I do doesn't always justify itself financially, Swami says. The paragraph before, were I in a position of still having to prove myself, there would be great objection to letting me work in the unorthodox way I do. And indeed there has been opposition from certain people for that very reason, for what I do doesn't always justify itself financially. So now he's going on from there. The creativity that my team represents happens to be set within a business format, Crystal Clarity, which is the publishing company. I had said earlier that Crystal Clarity, while Swami was still living at the village, even though it was an independent business, it was very much under Swami's influence and control. So if he was in charge of any department, it would have been Crystal Clarity, because at that time, with the exception of the books by Joseph Cornell, Bharat's books about nature and a cookbook, I think every book that was published virtually was by Swamiji. To be fair, we might have had a few books from a few other disciples. A little book by Hare Krishna Ghosh and by Peggy Dietz. Maybe we were publishing Kamala's books, but it was really Swamiji's books that we were publishing. My team is set in a business format, which is Crystal Clarity, but it isn't really a business at all, nor are our people who are going out singing, nor are our choirs. So he was saying that the team that Swami worked with may look like a business because it happened to operate under Crystal Clarity, since so much of Swami's music and writing would be distributed to the public through Crystal Clarity, and that team would see to the production of it. But he was trying to say that's just an accident of organization. It's not a business in any normal sense. And then Swami adds, nor the choirs, nor the music. All of his creative team were also musicians. So there was an overlap. And him supporting them to do his creative work also supported them to be musicians. And they were key, important musicians. And so it was a way of also supporting the music. But again, none of that was really a business enterprise. If work of that nature and our music in general could be thought of separately from its profitability and considered rather a long-term investment, important to be kept intact for that reason, at least the issue would be clear-cut. So he says, let's not even pretend that the music is a business. It just isn't. And in fact, in certain ways, Swami's books aren't a business either. It's all about awakening people to the spiritual life, getting them in tune, drawing them into the spiritual life. The financial benefit of that comes on a much longer term basis because they become supporters, they become members, they become residents, and if there's financial benefit that flows, but it's not really because I produced a record, they bought the record, there was a profit of $5 on the album. It's more like people become awakened to Master's Ray, they begin to meditate, they take Kriya, they come to the expanding light, and there may never be a direct one-to-one between the album or the CD that they heard and the fact that they now are taking major courses at the expanding light or even have taken up residence. But it's a long-term investment. It helps what keeps everything alive. It would then, so he says, at least if we just say that out loud, then we won't get confused. We won't keep trying to apply a business model where a business model doesn't apply. It could then be understood that there are aspects of our work that do simply require support. Even if at present we can bring only a few things to market, it surely is worthwhile to keep the machinery going, especially while I am still alive and able to keep the creativity flowing. There may even be creative ways of paying some of their salaries. For instance, the colonies all benefit from this creative output. Colonies is the branch communities other than the village. Perhaps they would consent without letting them feel that their arms were being twisted, but simply by letting them know the difficulty, to contribute a monthly tithe, perhaps to be deducted from sales at their boutiques, or perhaps by some value-added tax on those sales. So he's saying the music and Swami's creative work makes the whole work vibrant and alive, so why should we just think in terms of the economy of Ananda village supporting it, when once Swami's creative output, sort of goes out to a greater public, it's all of us who benefit. So Swami's just, in his usual way, instead of looking at a situation in its most narrow, he steps back and sees it from its most expanded point of view and then sees where the energy would lead. I have invested, Swami says, I estimate at least $200,000 personally as a gift to Ananda in the equipment used in those departments, the recording equipment primarily, and also computers and other things that facilitated the music programs. For a time he had this music computer that was an early development and didn't prove fruitful, but a lot of what Swami did, microphones and cameras and so on. And he also built a whole studio, a whole recording studio, so he could create easily without having to leave home and without having to pay rent in a recording studio. It was a huge advantage, because when you're renting a recording studio at many hundreds of dollars an hour, you can't record according to inspiration. You have to record according to finances and schedules. So he built a recording studio, which still exists at Ananda Village. In addition, I have about 15,000 color slides, another investment, a donation in fact, of many thousands of dollars more. Slides, of course, you had to buy film and you had to develop them. It was very different than the digital age. At present, the impression is that that team can't produce the money to justify their employment, except on a project basis. If this is the decision, their focus will simply have to shift elsewhere. At the time that this happened, I was aware of it, but when Swami writes it out like this, which of course I read this letter, he'd built up this creative team, and now, literally, as soon as Swami left the village, well, there's no point in this team anymore, and this effort was made just to fire them all. And the creative potential of those departments will be vitiated once again, I might add. The music ministry has suffered continuously over the years in this regard, meaning if it doesn't pay for itself, the people who think in terms that things should pay for themselves just want to get rid of it. But Swami has said in other contexts that the music is the lifeblood of Ananda. Most composers in history have been harried financially, and far more than I have. In this respect, I am grateful. Even so, I cannot but feel that in the name of pressing monetary considerations, we are denying ourselves something almost as precious as our very survival. Now, I prefaced this and explained yesterday that Ananda Village had actually gone into bankruptcy, into Chapter 11 at this point. We had been struggling against this lawsuit for 8 years. It cost us about $1 million a year. It was a 12-year litigation. It cost $13 million. Some of that was raised as we went along. Some of that was borrowed. All of us, I mean, the amount of money that we raised from the number of people we have, considering the income level of the people we had, but we all it was just necessary. It was necessary for our very survival. And basically a tremendous amount of what discretionary income we had just was donated, just month after month, year after year. And then the word would go out that we needed more money. We would just double our donations. And that was just the way we lived for those years because our very existence was threatened. So a few hundred people, really, because it was the most dedicated people at Ananda. And for a long time, we didn't fundraise beyond our closest in membership because the whole litigation was such an embarrassment to Master's work. We didn't want to publicize it. We thought we could just handle it, finish it, and then it would go away. And no one would ever know that direct disciples of Master were fighting each other. But gradually we had to expand because we simply couldn't carry it. But it was just a handful of people, a few hundred people. We ended up with a couple of million in debt, but we did pretty well. But, Swami's saying, so I'm just saying that because the financial pressure was real. This wasn't like an overreaction. But the idea that the music was expendable was always what people would think. And it was so difficult for Swami. They just couldn't see that without the music you couldn't function. I'm not a musician. I have it inside of me, but I can't perform. But when I would speak or travel, I would always have musicians with me. I mean, you see, even right here, when I start this class, whenever Keshav is available, I ask him to chant because the music, the chanting, and Swami's songs. Well, the way I would joke about it, before I lived here, which Palo Alto, which has now been more than 30 years, when I was basically doing the same work, but I was doing it as a circuit preacher. I was just traveling around. I always traveled with a musician, somebody who could play the guitar and sing. I would never go out to give public programs without someone who could play the music and sing. Everywhere I've gone, I've always taken someone with me because I sort of say to them, in a 3.5-minute song, you can change the whole energy of the room. I can talk for an hour and a half and hope that I get it across. But if you start with just a few of those songs, and if we can stop what we're doing and have music in the middle, I couldn't present these teachings without it. But maybe it's because I do the public work that I've always understood that. I've been so many times in a room full of people who are new to Ananda, and I've just watched how the music and the chanting just changed the atmosphere. And I'm adequate at the chanting, but I'm not able to carry it. So I would just bring someone with me. I mean, it never occurred to me that it was too expensive because it was too impossible without it. But not everybody has been in that circumstance as often as I have, and it may not be obvious to them the way it has been. And also, many times people don't get the words, but they get the music. Swami writes elsewhere, or maybe it's in here, half the people I was reading it, it's in Light Bearer actually, that the Swami writes in some place that, so many people who write to him tell him that it's the music that drew me to Ananda, and it's the music that holds me. What to speak of what it does for the people who perform it. The projects in which this team is involved will not all bear instant financial fruit. Some of them would require outlays of money that we simply don't have, and must therefore await their turn. So he says, we can't just turn what their work into income quickly. It's not that kind of work. But there are considerations here that could be weighed in the balance and not dismissed simply because they don't conform to certain existing policies. Even in normal businesses, there are investments that don't bear immediate fruit financially. Some of them, of necessity, bear fruit only in time. Some of them, again, bear fruit only indirectly. See, the thing with Ananda and the spiritual life is people's commitment to Ananda, and therefore their generosity and their donations and their memberships and their participation. It's not easily quantifiable. It's that something touches someone, and we all can trace our own history. I was touched by this. I read this book. I heard this song. I had this experience with someone, and then gradually, commitment grows. And also, what is our work? We have to support it financially. We have to be practical in our idealism. But our work, of course, is to bring people closer to God. And the music and Swami's publications, his creative output, in other words, is the primary thing that we have. So he says, so also is advertising. Research and development fall into this category. So also at Ananda is my own creative output. So just as I was saying, and it has not always been easy to persuade people, even of the need for my books and music. You recall that time years ago when serious thought was given to suspending the publication of my books for the present in favor of two better-selling books, Bharats and the Ananda Cookbook. That actually was a suggestion. Well, these are the books that are selling, so let's concentrate on these and we'll just wait on Swami's. On the other side of this balance, I have to say that of the many birthday cards I received, here's what I was looking for. This year, a significant number of them, quite possibly the majority, mentioned that what first drew them to Ananda was the music. Many added that it is above all the music that holds them here still. I know someone who became a very significant leader at Ananda, dropped into Ananda just for like a day the first time, heard a couple of Swami's songs. I think also even heard Swami speak, only remembered the music. And the music just stayed with him. And not too much longer later, he became a significant leader of Ananda. It was the music that he remembered. The books finally have won a place for themselves, although thanks to the disaster we ran into 3 years ago, their acceptance by certain members remains still precarious. What that was is when we got involved with Warner Books, and it derailed the direction of our publishing company for a while. I don't know if there's a letter about that in here or not, but that's what he's referring to. We got deflected from the fact that our work is a ministry, not a business, and they ended up with a lot of debt. We have much to lose, however, if the music, recordings of lectures and classes, color sides, and similar aspects of our creative work are shelved for more immediate, quote, practical considerations. This whole letter began when Swami was talking about a community called Dalbag, which started out as a spiritual ashram and ended up, my recollection is, as a shoe factory, but let's just say it ended up as a business. Gradually, business considerations just became more and more the norm, and everybody thought that made sense, until finally they really even weren't an ashram anymore. So Swami's fear is not imaginary. The fear of what others may say if we maintain these admittedly more long-term investments of time, personnel, and energy in favor of more immediate considerations could set Ananda on a long-term course toward materialism and toward the loss of both its spiritual and its creative impulses. This is why Swami wrote this letter. It's just terribly uneasy. And Swamiji, as I was saying when I did the first half of this letter, is that Swamiji had a very powerful instinct and intuition for when decisions made today were going to take us someplace where we really didn't want to be. And where he would intervene in the direction of Ananda was when he felt that a serious wrong direction was being implemented, which is why he wrote this letter. It isn't as if this team couldn't generate short-term income as well. Investment in individual products could be kept small, especially in terms of their long-term and probable returns. And then now he lists out 4 practical suggestions. Number 1, this person, he just put blanks where the names are, so I'll say person A, could devote himself to cleaning up and preparing for production the hundreds of old tapes of talks and classes I gave, dating as far back as the 60s. Your energies would not have to be involved in this, but someone could create a tape of the month club of those old talks, and the income from that could be used to help pay his wages. Number 2, in addition, there are 5 years of old weekly radio talks, half an hour each, that could be prepared for sale to members and even offered as radio shows. I also have that 1 year's worth of 15-minute talks, 5 days a week, that I did just 2 years ago. The qualities of these is, of course, superior to the old ones when I had cheap equipment, but the old ones also could be cleaned up electronically. 3, someone, again not you, but another person who was freer and able to be personally involved, person B perhaps, or could put energy into getting some of those talks out on radio again. KVMR springs to mind. That's the local station, isn't it, Nevada County? This wouldn't be income, but it would be excellent outreach as well as advertising. We need someone to involve himself in getting radio exposure for our teachings. Number 4, my slides, here person C and person D come to mind, could be turned into small print runs of beautiful cards with saying from the secrets books. The investment here could be quite small. There's no need here to think nationally for now. They can even run the cards off on equipment they already have, real desktop publishing, but in runs sufficient to help them earn at least enough to support themselves. At least it would be preparing a backlog of work that could become a much bigger financial success for Ananda in the future. So you see how practical Swami is? He doesn't just say do something, find a way. He says here's 4 really specific ideas. Swamiji often said it wasn't so much that he wanted people to just do what he said. He said sometimes somebody else have a much better idea, but he's just trying to say, let's creative problem solve. Let's think about how we can get an energy flow going. And also, the way Swami's thinking here, it's easy to say, well, that's not going to earn much, that's not going to earn much. But once you do what you can do in the direction of where you're trying to go, especially when you're working for God, often other avenues open up. Swamiji is very interesting. Swami was separated from his monastic life from the monastic order of Self-Realization Fellowship when he was 36 years old. He was essentially penniless. He had maybe $1,000. He went to live with his parents. I talked about this last time. And from that, he was alone because he was separated from everyone who had become his friends on the spiritual life. He was without a community. He was without friends. He was without supporters. He was still a disciple of Master, and he was absolutely determined to continue in his service to Master. From that point, he never earned money by any means other than doing things that would spread Master's teaching. Now, he learned to play the guitar, he started writing songs, he wrote and published books, he taught classes, he worked very hard. The only time he ever worked for someone else was when he took a job with the Peace Corps, training people to go to India. And his expectation when he did that would be that he would be able to teach them about the spiritual teachings of India and that it would enhance their experience. As it happened, only a very small number of people were actually interested in what he had to say. So he actually brought someone else in to train them in what they wanted to know, and then took the very small group and did it sort of after hours. With that single exception, that's the only time Swami ever worked for anyone else, and And he thought he would be spreading Master's teachings in doing that. Everything that he created for Ananda, he did by first thinking of a way to spread Master's teachings, then trying to think of a way that he could support himself doing it. So here, too, when he's trying to solve the problem, he never goes outside of that. He says, here's what we have. These are beneficial to Master. This is what we could do. We could take, these different sayings. It's really quite extraordinary. And it was, Swami felt he'd given his life in service to his guru. And he wasn't going to take it back merely because he had to support himself. He was, now most people don't have the karma that's as strong and as forceful as Swamiji's, but he did. And so he's trying to get us also to think within the realm of just continuing to serve Master, that we can also support ourselves, that God will support us if we do our part. But again, I was also saying, see how practical he is. He doesn't just leave it open-ended. He said, what about this idea and what about that one? It was just the first ones he thought of to get the energy moving. I confess, and Swami now goes on to say, I confess I'm becoming worried about policies that set projects like these aside as impractical. See, this is the word, and he's used it several times. It's like if it doesn't bring in money, it's not practical. I mean, I know when Swami was on a radio program and he was talking about faith in God and spiritual life, and the announcer said to him, well, I can appreciate all of that, but, what do you do practically to support yourself? And Swami said, faith in God is the most practical thing there is. Serving God and Guru is the most practical way to live. So Swami becomes nervous when the word practical becomes equated with makes money. He just, because of the direction it sets. And once you start in that direction, you start, if the people in charge start thinking like that, then they start hiring people who think like them. And then we even start attracting people who think like that. And when he talked about Dalbag earlier, he talked about eventually in that community, the spiritual people just left because it just became a business. There was no room for them anymore. That's why Swami says we're going to lose our spiritual and creative impulses. I've tried here to suggest ways that would bring instant returns from them to justify them from a budgetary point of view. But it's the long term that will show their real value to us. We may feel we can't handle the output we have already, but that is only for now. The potential for future output is not only many times greater, but what will be in growing demand if we keep our spirit of devotion and service alive. Swami was always very optimistic about the financial potential of everything he was creating. It's very funny because that became a bone of contention, because Swami would make very optimistic predictions about how this book would sell or how this music would go or the number of people who would come to this event. And generally speaking, they weren't realized in the way he expected. And I remember having this conversation with Swami. Swami was completely astute. He always knew what was going on around him. Whether or not he commented on it was something else. That was during that period of time when Ananda was going to become prosperous, and this was in the late 70s. We were sort of studying this prosperity theory and that prosperity theory. I never could get much interested in that. I was alone with Swami and I was talking about it. I put this, actually, I believe, in both the books I've written about Swami. I said, sir, it seems to me that Master's teachings would have everything we need to know about prosperity. I don't necessarily see the necessity to go study others who don't have the overview that Master has of the nature of life. And then Swami said, of course that's true. And then he said, the secret of prosperity is creativity. I was very surprised when he said that, but I've since come to understand exactly what he means. He said just having the creativity, that if one thing doesn't work, you try something else. And if that doesn't work, you try something else. And you keep working until you find the thing that does work, the idea that is the one that is really going to move forward. That's just what Swami's saying here. You don't just shift directions. You don't just drop in the name of being impractical. But then he went on to say, he said, I know people think that I'm just a dreamer. And he said, because every year for Spiritual Renewal Week, he would say 150 people are going to come this year. And he said, and then 30 would come. And Swami said, but if I didn't put out the thought that 150 were coming, he said, we wouldn't even get the 30 that do come. And it was just like, he knew exactly what he was doing. He was building magnetism. And he said, if other people, oh, that was the other thing he said. If other people worked as hard as I do, he said, it would be entirely different than it is. He didn't, I'm not quoting him exactly, but that was the words. In other words, he put out a tremendous amount of energy to make Ananda successful. And I know, certainly speaking for myself, I mean, I did my best, but all these years later, the difference between the way I put out energy, the kind of energy, the scattered nature of my energy, I did my best, and I was not an embarrassment. But I gradually began to understand what Swami was doing, the magnetism that he was putting forth, the commitment, the determination, the ability he had to pull Master's energy into what we were doing and therefore bring success from another angle completely than just the dollars and cents over here. This is what Swamiji was becoming so concerned about. As he said, there'll be a growing demand if we keep our spirit of devotion and service alive. He was very worried when he wrote this letter. Please don't take ill anything that I've said, Swami says again. I want to repeat how grateful I am for all that you are doing. At the same time, the deep disappointment I felt these past months is, I know, directly related to the seemingly impenetrable wall of material difficulties we've encountered in our joyful efforts to bring God to people. I would feel we'd lost everything if we lost that joy in a maze of bureaucratic necessities. Without joy, what is Ananda? So that's where he was. It was really a dilemma, because practically speaking, litigation had driven us to the wall financially. At the same time, it has to be said, the 90s, those litigation years were the most expansive years in Ananda's history. All of our communities beyond the village were founded during those years, and our churches were established. So it was an extremely strange time. Because on one hand, we were being just decimated financially, and on the other hand, we were moving forward on a level that has never been equal. So Divine Mother was playing with us. In Master's love, Swami signs the letter. Okay, so we're done with that one. This one is from March 1st, 1999, about a year later. And the more good one does is how it's summarized. I don't have any idea why Swami wrote this, so I'll just read the letter and see if I can remember. I believe the best way to meet those carping critics is with silence. The work we are doing will speak more and more for itself, and those critics are already revealing themselves as having nothing to contribute to the world other than their incredible hostility toward us. So this must have been a fallout from the litigation years, where, because it was an argument between Gurubhais, people who opposed Swami and Ananda felt that they were on Master's side. They felt that God was on their side. So I guess they have nothing to contribute to the world other than their incredible hostility toward us. There were people, and there still are some, who just spend their time criticizing. It's just why, but nonetheless they do. Incredible, I say. Incredible, the meaning of incredible not credible. Not incredible means I can't believe it. We tend to use it in a different way now, but that's what it really means. Incredible, I say, yet history provides countless examples of the same behavior. The more good one does, the more one attracts hostility from certain quarters, though also gratitude and appreciation from others, love. So somebody must have written Swami and said, should we try to answer the people who criticize us? There were things going on in the Nevada County newspaper as the bankruptcy thing went forward. We were just always, every so often, we would get criticized. This business about the more good one does, there was a very unfortunate thing that happened last night, not to Ananda, but to a community called Findhorn in Scotland. Findhorn has sort of been a cousin of Ananda's since the early 70s. They might have started they started almost exactly at the same time. Peter Caddy and his wife Eileen were and a couple of other people whose names I can't recall. They had another cohort, the small cohort, and they founded the Findhorn community at the same time we were founding Ananda. They're way out in Scotland, and they became very well known at the beginning because they did extraordinary work with the devas, and as a result did remarkable things with plants and gardening, and they were just all together and are a really wonderful group of kindred spirits. Sometime in the 70s, 80s, might have been in the 80s or the late 70s, Peter Caddy came to America, and he came to see Swami Kriyananda. Swami had been to Findhorn and had spoken at programs there, and right before Peter Caddy came to visit us, the temple that they had just built on the Findhorn, in the Findhorn community, burned to the ground, and it actually had been arson. It was deliberately burned to the ground. And Ananda's temple in 1971, 1970. And the Ananda temple also burned to the ground. When it was at the seclusion retreat, it was the only temple we had. It was not deliberate. It was an accident. Candle left burning at night, and so the whole temple went to the ground. So Swami had been through it. So he was commiserating with Peter about the loss of the temple, because Swami knew what a financial and emotional setback it could be. And Peter Caddy, I was there. I was helping Swami host. And Peter said, if people aren't persecuting you, it means you're not doing enough good for the world. He said, so the fact that someone felt that we were important enough to try to stop us, he says, I take that as a sign of great success. Peter was very hearty as a person. So I've always remembered that. We were being, I think at the time, we were in war with our neighbors to keep our mailbox standing. They kept knocking it down, we kept putting it up. And that was when Peter said, if you're not being persecuted, you're not doing enough good for the world. But last night, Findhorn lost their central building again. I'm presuming they called it, they lost their main sanctuary and their community kitchen dining room. It burned down, and it was deliberately set. The man who set it was arrested by the police. Unbelievable. I mean, fortunately, they're a mature community, and as they said very simply, buildings can be rebuilt. No one was hurt, and the spirit is still strong. If you feel to, if you just look it up in the news story, I just looked it up on Google because I'd heard it as a rumor. They have an American fundraising. If you feel to just support them, it would be a very generous and a good thing to do, either give them a real sum of money or even just symbolically. I indicated that they asked you if you wanted to honor someone. I wrote Swami Kriyananda's name because I wanted them to know that I wasn't acting just as an individual, but as a sister community. So they're obviously doing really good work. Someone tried to stop them again. But oh my, that's, if you're not part of a community, and let me just how to say it. When you're building a community, as they have been and we have done, when when money is obtainable, but it all has to be worked for, dollar for dollar, when something that you've spent so much time creating and have had so many wonderful experiences inside of, when it gets taken away, it's an emotional blow. In 1976, when a lot of our community burned, which was now a long time ago, we weathered it. I personally didn't lose my dwelling, but a lot of people did. Jyotish and Devi, Durga and Vidura, many, many others. By the end of that summer, we were still standing and we were still going strong, but we were tired. I just remember the feeling of the end of that summer. It takes a lot of willpower just to keep going against obstacles like this. You can, and it's the making of you, but it takes a lot of energy. And we were very much helped by many communities coming to help us at that time. The temple at the seclusion retreat was destroyed a second time, maybe 20 years later. It collapsed in the snow. Someone told me recently that they thought that the wooden struts were being eaten by termites, and that's why when the snow level was it collapsed. Dambara was inside the temple when it fell. It was early in the morning. He was in the habit of going in to meditate. Early in the morning, it was snowing, it was cold, and he's a creature of very specific habits. He was very, very definite about what he does, and he always would sit in the same place in the temple, right up close to the altar, because he was usually alone at the very early hour. But that day it was a little bit cold, and uncharacteristically he moved back and was, I believe, sitting closer to the heater, if I'm not mistaken. And he was inside, and he was chanting. People always asked him later, what were you chanting? Unfortunately, I can't remember. I'm sure if you go somewhere on Google, you can find his account of this, because he wrote it up. But the dome structure collapsed, and if he had been sitting where he usually sat, he probably would have been killed, or at least seriously injured. But because he'd moved to another spot, and I think it was because of the heater or something about the structure there, it fell in such a way that he was untouched. It's just like Divine Mother is, if you love God, you're protected in the midst of all these things. So thank God even for Findhorn, no one was hurt. But now they, will have to start over again. Fortunately, it's summer, not winter, but it's not a congenial climate there, so it's not easy. I've enjoyed reading a lot of stories about saints and their lives and spiritual works. And success on the spiritual path, success for a spiritual work is rarely a straight line. I've been doing a Wednesday night class about Jesus and have just wonderfully immersed myself in the New Testament and the whole story again. The Wednesday night class, it's a paid class, by the way, so if you're interested in it, it's been going for many months, but it's all posted. If you're interested, I highly recommend it. It's been a wonderful class. But of course, what happened to the apostles immediately after the death of Jesus is that they were all martyred, almost all of them. And they were thrown out of their temples and ostracized by their people. It was by no means this sort of great, glorious Jesus resurrected and we all marched together into worldwide Christianity. Absolutely the opposite. It was 300 years of great difficulties and often martyrdom and being thrown to the lions and, kind of lots of things that do not look like success. Because sometimes, well, as Swami put it very simply, blood has to be spilled. It's often the blood of the martyrs. That sounds so weird when you say it. Like, why? But history shows that tapasya is a wonderful Sanskrit word for which there is no English equivalent. Tapasya is usually described as austerity, defined as austerity. But tapasya also means concentration. And I don't think the word tapasya means the same as pranayama, but it does sort of, which is conservation and focus of energy. And tapasya can also be defined as devotion. Because what it is that we withdraw energy from certain places that it could be spent, direct it in one place, and we build energy by that. You know, this world is it's a push-pull of magnetism. This is what Swami's writing about in the letter, the one just before. It's a constant push-pull of magnetism, and the carping critics too. It's a shadow and light universe, and those of us who are dedicated to putting out the light, we have to. It's the battle of Kurukshetra. You really have to put out force. You don't wander onto a battlefield reading a novel and eating an apple. You have to gather all your forces and deny yourself everything else and then push forward. And it's that power that makes something happen in this world. Otherwise, the dissipating forces are just too strong. They just suck your energy away from you. When I was in India with Swamiji in 2004, when he had just moved there. He moved there in November of 2003. And as soon as he got there, he started having one physical issue after another. And at one point he was in the hospital with double pneumonia. And he was just sort of in and out of this small hospital that was fairly near the ashram. He was having, well, it's called congestive heart failure, which is a terrible sounding thing and is, if it's allowed to progress to its end point. But he was in the hospital again when I was visiting him once there. And the hospital, it was sort of this small private hospital. It was definitely a hospital, but it was homey. It wasn't like a big industrial strength place. It was very homey. Swami had his regular room, and the whole staff knew him there. And he had a whole routine because he just needed, sometimes intravenous care. He needed to rest. He just needed to be there. So he was there, and this sadhu, Swami, from somewhere, I don't know his name, I've never saw him before or after, he came to visit Swami. And he expressed sympathy for his being in the hospital and so on. Swami laughed very merrily. I was in the room there. He just laughed merrily, and he said, "Oh, I'm just doing Tapasya to build my guru's work in India." Now, great souls can do Tapasya through their bodies, which is what Swami did his entire incarnation. He was always doing penance, doing sacrifice, doing austerity in some physical way. He just used his body that way. But that builds up energy. If you think of it like an athlete training, the athlete, he doesn't stay up late, he doesn't go out drinking, he follows a very strict diet. He spends hours and hours a day building up both his mental and his physical strength. And then at the hour of competition, he has all that to draw on. He just knows he can do it. But if he didn't do all that tapasya, which is how it would look to most people, he wouldn't have the power when he needs it. So that's a very microcosm of this macrocosm, which is people have to do tapasya. And it doesn't necessarily feel like sacrifice, it feels like devotion. And see, that's that wonderful word. It feels like devotion. I lived for 10 years at Ananda village in the first 10 years in this tiny little trailer. I had no money to speak of, or not to speak of. I mean, I could live. I could buy the gas that I needed to cook and to keep my little trailer warm. I could buy enough food. Somehow or another, I managed to do everything that I needed to do. I never felt the slightest lack. Every so often, I would actually look at that trailer and realize, it was just a little hovel. It was this old travel trailer, and the one I lived in for a while had grass growing up through some cracks in the floor, and I found it charming. I just never thought about it. The door didn't quite hang right. It was just like, I loved it. I loved it. It never crossed my mind that it was tapasya. Never. It just didn't feel like that. I was so happy to be there. But that level of sacrifice, which is the willingness to work for no money, to believe in the cause, to pour every ounce of creative energy and physical energy, emotional energy I poured into the making of the friendships and making Ananda. It was absolutely marvelous. But someone might call it tapasya. It was devotion to me. So anyway, all of that is to say, then there comes the carping critics. If you're doing enough good, people will try to stop you. So you have to have energy. You have to be the athlete who, when somebody comes up behind you, has something more in them so they can streak to the finish line. It's not a competition, but it is a conflict. It's always a conflict between shadow and light. It's just the way it is. It's the way the planet is made. It'd be nice if it weren't, but it is that way because it makes us strong. It makes us strong. And the whole drama, the whole point of the drama is individual self-realization. And of course, the means to self-realization is to help others. But the result of that is that others are helped, and we are also blessed. The channel is blessed by that which flows through it. And the more intently and powerfully we do it, the more everyone is blessed. So Swami says, people want to keep criticizing us, no matter. Let us just put out we always sometimes say, keep putting out the light, but that has a double meaning. We don't mean extinguish the light. Keep expressing the light. Keep being an instrument for the light. So let's move along. So now this is written April 24th, the year 2000. After experiencing a miscarriage of justice, what would have happened? The personal character assassination lawsuit ended in 1998, or 99. At the beginning, the end of 98. Around the year 2000, the other litigation, it had been on appeal, and a piece of it was returned, and we had to have a jury trial eventually, so it went on for another couple of years. We thought we were finished, and we weren't finished. The appeal process took a long time, but when it finished, an issue of copyright law was returned for a jury trial. The judge, whose decision had been reversed, Judge Garcia, who was a marvelous judge, said, the appeals court is wrong. He just said that. They're wrong. It's the wrong decision, but he said, I'm bound by it. And then he also said, it's preposterous to ask a jury to decide a matter of copyright law. He said, it's a legal issue. It's not a jury issue. How can they know? So I don't know whether Swami was responding to the fact that a portion of it had been remanded and we had to go through another year of legal issues, or whether he was referring to the earlier 1998 issue. But this is what he said. I've pretty well lost faith in our legal system. For cases like murder, where only the facts are concerned, it may do well enough to hear first all the facts on one side, then all the facts on the other, and so on. For cases like ours, however, where facts are not so much the issue as opinions and emotions, the opposing attorney has as long as he wants to prejudice the jury beyond hope of redemption by the defense. This is in reference then to the character assassination lawsuit. Lies can't be challenged on the spot and countered. I myself was not given a chance even to speak in my own defense. Among the many things that happened in that sexual harassment, character assassination, Ananda is a cult and Kriyananda is a fiendish cult leader, was that the judge issued a sanction early on that said that Ananda could not defend itself. Swami Kriyananda could not defend. We could present no defense to the central charge of the case. That Swami was a sexual predator, in essence, which just was crazy. We were allowed to present no defense. Witnesses against him could not be cross-examined, and before they testified, they all knew they could not be cross-examined. The jury, however, for reasons that who knows, the jury was never informed that the judge had prevented us from presenting a defense. They just saw witnesses speak against him, so-called evidence be presented against him, anything that the witnesses said was never challenged, and they were not truthful, the testimony. We never challenged any of it. It all just stood. And the jury didn't know why. The jury just watched us present no defense. Watched Kriyananda say nothing in defense of himself. Watched our attorney say nothing to dismantle the testimony against him. Like, what conclusion were they supposed to draw? The only and obvious one was that we had no defense. Whereas, in fact, we had a very strong defense, but we weren't allowed to present it. I forgot about this. It's now been 20 years. I just don't even remember. So, it's like, and all of those rules and so on are all meant for good reason, but it was wild. I have never had to serve on a jury, but I came close once. But now, if I ever got called for a jury, I would just have to say, I know too much. I've sat in it, and I've sat in a jury trial, and I know that the jury only knows certain things. The jury does not know everything, because for this reason or that reason, it's kept from them. So he says, I'm pretty well, I've lost faith. So the system is hopeless. A lawyer like Mr. X, who was the man who was really against us, can do anything he wants, growing rich while destroying perfectly innocent lives. The legal system has changed a lot. This is something that I learned. The lawyer who opposed us let me say how to say it. When a lawyer presents false information, when he allows his witnesses to commit perjury, when he bluffs and doesn't really have anything to back it up, when he frankly lies, the enforcement system against an attorney is so cumbersome and so difficult to execute that the attorney can go really far and without anything happening. It just stands. And if the judge is sympathetic to his cause or to him as a person, which is what we faced in that litigation, it wasn't Judge Garcia. Judge Garcia was a different case, and he was wonderful. This man was not. So if the judge is supporting the lawyer can pretty much do anything he wants. Now, many attorneys don't behave that way because they have their own code of ethics. But if you don't have a code of ethics and what you want is to win or to make money, if you really look at the system, you can play it. And so this man played it. This man was notorious for being so horrible that people, and we learned this from other lawyers who had to litigate against him, you would settle your case just so you could stop it. And when I was talking about that earlier letter, and I talked about how before this case was over in 1998, he'd filed 4 or 5 or 6 other cases against all of us. He was just like there was no end to it. So you'll pay to get out of it. And it works. It's like a method if you want to use it. And so this is the world we live in. I could continue quite a bit on this vein. The important thing is to survive, which I've done by realizing that no one can take away my love for God, and that I have nothing to lose in any case, since all belongs to God. Someday I'll recount what a victory that lawsuit was for me and for Ananda. He means personally and morally and spiritually. But it was with no help from the system, the judge, or as it happened, even our own lawyer. We made a grievous error of judgment in the man we hired to defend us. And that didn't help either. Swami tried to get us to fire that man, but we didn't listen. I think I wrote this in Light Bearer. It's also written in Swami Kriyananda, as we've known him. I don't harp on these things. I do harp on them a little bit because I'm an old woman and I like my memories. But that's not really why I do it. I do it because it was extremely important in building Ananda, and it could happen again. I don't necessarily mean in exactly the same way, but there's profound principles involved here about what you face, how you face it, how you live through it, what is really victory, what you can depend on in this world, what you just have to wipe the dust of this world off your feet and go forward. We did not appeal that decision, even though everybody knew it had the shelf life of an apple, is how it was put to us. It absolutely would have been reversed. However, for among other things, because we weren't allowed to defend ourselves, because all you get when a case is remanded on appeal is that you get to have another trial, which was just out of the question. So we realized if we let it stand, it would be against us forever. But we had no choice, so we let it go. We didn't need to prove ourselves in their system, so that's where we were. So I believe that these principles are important, and I believe that these experiences are important, because also one has to appreciate that Ananda did not just grow like a tulip out of the ground without any help from anybody. A lot of people gave a lot of their life energy to making it happen. And it will not continue without that same kind of tapasya. Now, it might not be the same tapasya, but to just think that Ananda as a dynamic, flowering, creative, magnetic, extraordinary thing, which it is, unique in the whole world, but it won't stay that way if people just start drifting and taking it for granted and changing its values, because it's not buildings. Everything could burn down. Everything is ephemeral on that level. It's the spirit of the people, but this is the spirit of the people. This is the spirit that built it, which is we will persevere and we will do what is needed. And we will be faithful to what God has given us in the work that I do and that I've been doing all these years. Some of our projects succeed, some of them don't. Some things flower for a time. My only concern is not whether we're popular or whether we're rich or anything like that. Are we being faithful to the principles of Masters Ray as we learn them from Swami? Are we keeping the vibration of our work, as faithful as we are able to make it, to what the gurus are asking of us? And if we're true to the vibration, if we're true to the teachings, if we don't panic or compromise or allow self-interest to dominate over our devotion to God, then everything will be fine. Everything will be fine. Spiritual progress is not always just a straight linear line uphill. Sometimes it crashes, everybody gets thrown to the lions for a while. And everything goes to pieces. But if we are faithful, then God will be able to do what He wants to do through us. And that's simply what it is. And this experience of Swamiji and the way he handled it, the way he talked about it, the way he spoke to us, it was a unique teaching in the history of Ananda. There's just you can't just say, oh, it's in the past, because it was too formative. So we have to not think of it as a thing in itself, but what principles, when tested, how do we respond? When challenged, how do we respond? Okay, that's enough. So, we seem to be still talking about controversy. This was September 9th, 2001. This is about, to a leader of Ananda Seattle after the Swiss architect for their new temple withdrew from the project because of opposition from neighbors. What this is about is there was this wonderful man, he is a wonderful man, from Switzerland, who was an architect. He designed the first Temple of Light, which was built in our community in Assisi, Italy. And it was a beautiful, innovative design with a blue tile roof. It's lovely. And so in Seattle, when the leaders there wanted to build a temple, they wanted to model it after that temple of light. The temple that was dedicated in 2019 at Ananda village is also that same basic design. So they invited that architect to come to Seattle, make the design, and help them put it up. Now, of course, there's always controversy, so they had a little piece of land outside of Seattle in Bothell, I think is where it is, Bothell, Washington. And they successfully have built a temple. They call it the Blue Lotus Temple. It's been there for 15 or 20 years. They recently made it debt-free. It's been a very, very successful thing, but it was not without controversy. So the architect apparently, because there was opposition from the neighbors, he was disinclined to stay with the project. So Swami writes, there is a great difference, unfortunately, between the way these things are done in Europe and Switzerland. In Europe, one has the government to deal with. In America, where protest is an unfortunate but unpreventable fact of life, one has a truculent public to deal with. If we had allowed neighbors' complaints to be our definition of divine guidance, when Ananda was getting started, Ananda would never have happened. Over time, we've been able to show our neighbors that what we are doing is a blessing also for them. So he's just trying to say this is what happens in America. He's also saying that this man being from Switzerland just had no context in which to understand when, 4 of your neighbors write fierce and terrible letters about how awful you are. I believe that the ongoing litigation and the judgment against us also came forward as a reason why neighbors didn't want Ananda in their neighborhood. The only course to pursue in the present case is to ask ourselves, is there any truth or justice in their complaints? If there were, we should change. And it's a very good question. Do they have a real point? Merely because people don't like something doesn't mean that they have a real point. We can't just always be bowing to other people's opinions. But when their complaints sink to the level of protesting in print that we are planning to put up a 5-story building and other similarly outrageous lies, then it would be cowardly and absurd to bow before their opposition. So you say, here's another point. It would be cowardly and absurd to bow before their opposition. Earlier, when I was reading a letter a few sessions ago, when I was reading the letter about logging property, the Ananda village property, in order actually to deal with the bankruptcy and the judgment against us, the neighbors cried out in protest, and it appeared in print. Ananda's about to clear cut all 1,000 of their acres. It was just presented as a fact that we plan to clear cut our property. And we must be stopped. That was the exact opposite of what we had in mind. And now it goes up that there's a 5-story building, and it's just cowardly to just bow when people are upset. Sometimes you just have to stand your ground. There are people in America who fight everything, as we know from long and painful experience. Hunter Black's mother, as you told me, Hunter Black was a resident of Ananda Village, and he was from Seattle, Washington. He was from that area. As you told me, had to fight for 10 years to get a bicycle path past the city council because certain people protested that bicycles on that path would kill the snails, creatures that people need to control by killing them anyway, if they want lawns and gardens for their homes. In other words, yes, that's what happens. When faced with illogic, the only thing is to look at matters as clearly and fairly as possible. If these dissenters represented a majority, I'd say back down. But they don't. In fact, there are many who recognize what a good thing we'd be doing for their own neighborhood, on land that at present is a wilderness without the slightest ecological value. And when I was talking about the clear-cutting issue, I spent a lot of time talking about the difference between a sentimental attitude and a real, actual relationship to true things. So merely to just leave something as wilderness, Swami said, and I dealt with it several sessions ago, is not the same as doing a good thing for God and for nature even. Swami points out how the wicked witch always lives deep in the untended wild forest, and the princess always lives in the beautiful garden. And there's a reason for that. And he said the devas like it. The devas like it when we help them. So it is scenes like this one in Seattle that make me prefer, for now anyway, to live in Italy. So much unfair and unreasonable opposition based purely on prejudice, emotion, and anger. Frankly, this to me is the worst aspect of America these days. Oh my, I'm glad Swami isn't here to see it now. But as regards our temple, it will be a great asset. Many people see it as at least potentially that. The objectors are people, now Swami's being very frank here. Swami doesn't mince words. The objectors are people of low energy and are not the kind of people who ought to be allowed to control things to the extent they do. Defeat for them would be a victory of truth over injustice. Victory for them would be a victory of mob rule over fairness and common sense. Seen from this perspective, I see no alternative for us except to go ahead and do what is right. So once again, this is how Swami handles it. And people nowadays, many, well, they have a point of view. We have to see their point of view. We have to allow space for their point of view. We have to try to make peace with everything. That's actually what the Swiss man wanted. He just didn't want to stand up to the opposition. He took opposition itself as a sign that the project wasn't meant to go forward. Swami says that's ridiculous. Just as simple as that, it's ridiculous. It's what I was saying earlier. It's always a battle of light and shadow. You don't have to be angry. You don't have to be judgmental. You can be perfectly calm and loving, but you can also be definite. Well, I'm sorry you feel that way. We're not going to change. And it's like the equality is on the divine level. It's not always on the human level. Disharmony is a guide to what not to do when it becomes too widespread. So this is the question, because they wrote to Swami, well, the architect has walked away. Does that mean we should quit? Disharmony is a guide of what not to do when it becomes too widespread, as opposed to being only the inevitable hotheads. When opposition can be justified by reason, when it affects those whom we are trying to help, when it produces disharmony in our own hearts. Otherwise, the battle of Kurukshetra, that's the battle described in the Bhagavad Gita, was righteous. And Arjuna's qualms, which is what prompted Krishna's dissertation, which is the Bhagavad Gita, and Arjuna's qualms were born of misunderstanding the realities. I'm going to read that paragraph again, and that'll be the end of tonight. Disharmony is a guide of what not to do when it becomes too widespread, as opposed to being only the inevitable hotheads. When it can be justified by reason, meaning when the objections really do make sense. This is really a bad idea. We shouldn't do it. When it affects those whom we are trying to help, meaning if the opposition, if you're trying to help a certain group and it's they themselves that don't want to do it. The devotees don't want a temple in Bothell. Okay, well, we're trying to do it for the devotees and they don't want it, so we have to think about it. When it produces disharmony in our own hearts, when it means I can't fight this battle because it upsets me too much. I've been engaged in a difficult situation for the last couple of years. There was a point when, for almost 2 months, I absolutely dropped out. I didn't get emails, I didn't converse, I didn't go to any meetings because it was too upsetting to me. And I would have stayed out of it for the rest of the time, except I mastered it. So, sometimes it's too hard. We can't do it. And we have to just be honest about that. Fortunately for me, it was only temporary. But it was true. I couldn't do it. I couldn't handle it. And that's a time also when opposition says we have to quit. Otherwise, the battle of Kurukshetra was righteous. It was a righteous war. And Arjuna's qualms were born of misunderstanding the realities. Love, Swami. Okay, my friends, and let's see how much longer this is going to go on. I think we might be through the worst of it in this section. The worst of it, I mean, just these incredibly difficult situations that we've had to go through, but we have to go through them. And I was just saying, you know, our brothers and sisters in Findhorn have just had a huge blow. There's not a point at which it stops. It just doesn't, because we all have to become liberated. So whatever karma we need to face is going to come to us. And calm acceptance and joy is what Swamiji recommends, so we'll have to do our best. All right, my friends, God bless you.